Charlotte Voss drove the Aston Martin DB11 into the fifth garage in 3 weeks and received the exact same answer she had gotten from the 4 places before it: the transmission was dead. Replace it. The total estimate across all 5 quotes had climbed to $271,000. She was standing with a pen in her hand, nearly ready to authorize the work order, when her assistant leaned in and whispered a name: a worn-down garage on the western edge of town, run by a single father almost no one knew existed. No neon sign, no showroom, just motor oil and the sound of metal against metal, and a man named Isaac Hayes wiping his hands on a faded rag, looking like someone who had never in his life needed to impress anyone. Charlotte Voss had built Voss Prestige Motors into the 3rd largest luxury vehicle distribution network in the country before she turned 34, and she had done it without apology. She ran meetings the way surgeons ran operating rooms, with precision, economy, and the clear understanding that every second of indecision carried a cost. She did not arrive late. She did not offer unnecessary warmth. She did not waste time on feelings when facts were available, and she had spent enough years in boardrooms to know that people who led with emotion rarely lasted long enough to matter. The dealerships under the Voss name moved everything from Bentley to Lamborghini, and Charlotte had personally approved the purchase of the Aston Martin DB11 that now sat immovable in her private lot, an $800,000 machine she had selected as a gift to mark 10 years of partnership with Elliot Graves. The car had not been merely a gift. It had been a statement, the kind she had learned from her father's example, that the Voss name was synonymous with the finest things that moved on 4 wheels, and that 10 years of partnership with a man like Graves deserved something that could not be replicated by a wire transfer or a card with a signature. She had driven 3 different DB11s before settling on the specification, the color, the stitching, the bespoke instrument panel, and she had taken satisfaction in knowing that the car was exactly right. It had been, until it wasn't. Elliot Graves was not a man who asked for much. He held 18% of the Voss Group's equity, had been her father's closest ally before her father's retirement, and had never once raised his voice in a meeting or sent an email in anger. He did not need to. His silence carried weight that other men's speeches never could, and when he called to confirm, he would be arriving the following Friday to take a drive in the DB11, the car Charlotte had described in her own words as a symbol of everything the Voss name stood for. She had felt the pressure of that conversation settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The car had died on a Tuesday afternoon. Graves had been in the passenger seat for a demonstration run along the waterfront when the transmission locked mid-gear, the engine threw a harsh, grinding noise into the cabin, and the car rolled to a dead stop at the edge of an intersection. Graves said nothing. He waited for the tow, accepted the ride Charlotte arranged, and spoke only once before climbing into the substitute vehicle. He told her he looked forward to seeing the DB11 when he returned from Boston. His tone was not angry. It was something quieter, and Charlotte had always found quiet far more difficult to carry than anger. She called her head of technical operations from the side of the road while the flatbed was still loading the car. The instruction was direct. The car needed to be perfect within 7 days, and he was authorized to spend whatever was required to make that happen. She had not imagined, standing on that curb watching the DB11 rise onto the back of the truck, that 7 days would become 3 weeks of compounding silence and 5 very expensive dead ends. She had not imagined it because in the world Charlotte Voss operated in, problems at sufficient cost could always be solved. The only variable was the number. This time, the number kept changing, and the problem kept standing in place, unmoved, immovable, silent. The first call went to the authorized Aston Martin dealership on the north side, the only certified service center within 60 miles. Their lead technician spent 2 full days with the DB11 before delivering his conclusion with the calm authority of someone accustomed to delivering expensive news. The torque converter had failed, the electronic control module governing the transmission had suffered cascading errors as a result, and the recommended path was a complete transmission rebuild paired with new ECU programming. Estimated cost, $187,000. with a projected timeline of 6 to 8 weeks pending parts availability from the factory in Gaydon. Charlotte authorized a second opinion before the first invoice had even been printed. The ZF Service Center, the German manufacturer responsible for the actual gearbox unit inside the DB11, flew in a regional specialist who spent 3 days performing his own diagnostic. His report used different language but arrived at the same place. The clutch pack assembly had suffered thermal damage consistent with sustained overload. The internal hydraulic circuit was compromised, and the unit needed to be replaced as a complete assembly. His quote came in at $214,000, with a 10-week lead time for the replacement unit. The third shop was a private facility called Exotic Transmission Specialists, a name that had come up twice among Charlotte's technical team, and once in a trade publication she had skimmed on a flight to Chicago. The owner had 40 years of experience with European luxury drivetrains and had personally worked on vehicles belonging to 3 motorsport teams. He looked at the DB11 for one afternoon and told Charlotte's technical liaison that the gearbox was not repairable. The internal damage, in his professional view, exceeded what any rebuild could address. The vehicle needed a new transmission unit sourced directly from the manufacturer. The price? $271,000. He did not offer a timeline because he considered the question premature until Charlotte confirmed she wanted to proceed. A fourth opinion came from Prestige Auto Engineering, a competing service network that Charlotte would normally never have approached. She approached them anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was not something she knew how to do. Their senior technician reviewed the diagnostic data from the first 3 evaluations, spent an afternoon with the vehicle himself, and submitted a report that aligned closely with the third shop's findings. The transmission was beyond economical repair. Replacement was the only viable path. His quote was $265,000. The fifth came from an independent technical consultant, a German engineer who had spent 2 decades working with European manufacturers and now operated as a private advisor to high-net-worth collectors. Charlotte's assistant had tracked him down through a contact in Stuttgart. He reviewed everything remotely, requested 36 photographs of specific components, and submitted a single-page summary. The vehicle had reached the end of its serviceable transmission life. Replacement was the rational choice, and he would not recommend further diagnostic investment in the existing unit. Charlotte stood in her office the afternoon. The 5th report arrived, holding the entire stack of assessments in her hand, $271,000. A car that was supposed to be a symbol of the Voss standard, sitting unusable in a lot, with 8 days remaining before Elliot Graves landed at the airport. She had not eaten lunch. She had canceled 2 meetings without rescheduling them, which her assistant would later describe as the single most alarming signal of the entire ordeal. Charlotte Voss did not cancel meetings. She sat down slowly in the chair behind her desk, looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city below, and thought about her father, who had built the first Voss dealership in a strip mall in Glendale with 12 employees and a handshake philosophy, and who had told her once, when she was still young enough to learn things without resistance, the most expensive mistake a person can make is paying to be wrong with confidence. She had been too successful for too long to remember that until now. Maya Collins had worked for Charlotte for 3 years and had learned in the first 3 months which battles were worth fighting and which were better left to time. She was 28, organized to a degree that bordered on architectural, and possessed of a quality rare in Charlotte's orbit. She told the truth, even when the truth was unwelcome, because she had long since calculated that the long-term value of honesty outweighed the short-term discomfort of delivering it. She knocked on Charlotte's office door at 4:30 in the afternoon and placed a small folded piece of paper on the desk without preamble. Charlotte looked at it. She looked at Maya. She asked what it was. A name, Maya said, and an address. The paper read, Isaac Hayes, Hayes Garage, Oak Creek Road, West Side. Charlotte picked it up the way she might pick up a note she expected to find disappointing. Isaac Hayes was 39 years old, Maya explained, working through it methodically. He had been raising his daughter alone since the girl was 9 months old. His grandfather had left him the garage, a 2-bay operation in a part of town the luxury vehicle world had never thought to pay attention to. He had no website, no digital footprint of any kind, no trade association membership, no industry publication appearances, no professional network that Charlotte's contacts could verify through normal channels. What he did have, and Maya had spent 2 full days confirming this through sources she considered genuinely reliable, was a career that had ended far too early, and a reputation that traveled only by word of mouth, which in her experience was always the reputation worth trusting, because it required no one to curate it. 3 months earlier, a private collector in Dallas had brought Isaac a Bugatti Chiron that the factory's own authorized service team in California had declined to accept for repair. The collector had been told the vehicle's drivetrain had suffered irreversible damage in a flooding incident and the repair was not viable. He had been quoted $400,000 for replacement components alone, plus labor, and had been advised to consider the car a total loss. Isaac Hayes had taken the car. 11 days later, the Chiron was running without fault. The collector paid Isaac $6,200 and offered him 10 times that amount to relocate to Dallas, with a fully equipped facility provided at no cost. Isaac had declined without appearing to consider it very long. Charlotte looked up from the paper. Her expression had not changed, but the quality of her silence had shifted in a way Maya had learned to recognize over 3 years. "I am not taking Elliot Graves's car to a garage on Oak Creek Road," she said. Maya placed a second document on the desk, a printed personnel record, partially redacted, from a source she later described only as someone who owed her a favor. The record identified Isaac Hayes as a senior transmission systems engineer at AMG Motorsport in Stuttgart, Germany. 11 years of service. Principal engineer on the development of the AMG speed-shift transmission system used in the GT Black Series. Multiple internal citations for diagnostic innovation and root cause methodology. Departure date, voluntary resignation, reason listed, personal circumstances. Charlotte read it twice. She set it down beside the first paper and looked at both together on the clean surface of her desk. The clock behind her head read 4:41. She had 8 days. She picked up the phone and handed it to Maya without another word. Maya was already dialing. Isaac answered on the third ring with the name of his garage, and when Maya explained who was calling and why, there was a pause long enough to make Charlotte wonder whether he had set the phone down. Then he said, "Bring it tomorrow morning, early." And that was all. The garage sat behind a chain-link fence on a stretch of Oak Creek Road where the sidewalk ended and the tree line began. The sign above the entrance had once been painted in dark green letters, but had faded over years to a pale suggestion of itself, readable only if you were already looking for it. Charlotte arrived at 7:15 in the morning in her rental car, wearing a gray wool suit and heels that had no legitimate business on a gravel lot, and found the gate already open. A Ford pickup from a previous decade sat on one of the 2 lifts inside, its undercarriage exposed and attended to. The other lift was empty, waiting. The bay smelled of oil and solvent, and something beneath both of those, something older and more honest. The smell of work done over a long time in a place that had never once been arranged for the comfort of observers. Isaac Hayes was on his back beneath the pickup. He did not come out when she parked. He did not announce himself. She stood beside her car for a moment, then walked to the entrance of the bay and said his name with the same measured tone she used in conference rooms. The rolling sound came from beneath the truck, and the man stood up in sections, first sitting, then rising, and she found that he was taller than she had expected, lean in the way people become when they work with their hands for 20 years without giving it any particular thought. He had a grease mark along his left forearm and another across his collarbone, and he looked at her the way someone looks at a weather report gathering information, without assigning emotion to any of it. Seated at a small wooden chair near the open bay door was a girl of about 7, wearing a school uniform and holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear with the easy authority of a child who had long ago decided the rabbit was non-negotiable. She glanced at Charlotte with frank, uncomplicated curiosity, then returned to the notebook she had been drawing in. Charlotte laid out the situation the way she had practiced it during the drive. The DB11, the 5 assessments, the quotes, the timeline, Graves's arrival in 6 days. She used technical language deliberately, the way people do when they want to establish whether the person across from them is fluent or merely familiar. Isaac listened with his arms folded and his eyes on a point somewhere past her left shoulder. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Where's the car?" The flatbed arrived 20 minutes later. Isaac walked around the DB11 3 times after it came off the truck, his hands clasped behind his back, not touching anything. Charlotte watched him and found the restraint quietly maddening. She was accustomed to technicians who put their hands on things immediately, who needed contact before understanding could begin. Isaac did not appear to need contact. He looked at the car the way someone reads a page before deciding where to begin. He asked 3 questions. The first, had the vehicle been professionally cleaned before any of the 5 diagnostic visits? Charlotte said yes, she had wanted it presentable. He nodded. The second, who had been driving when the failure occurred, and for how long? She told him she had been at the wheel, Graves in the passenger seat, approximately 12 minutes into the drive. The third, had any fluid been serviced in the 60 days prior to the failure? She pulled the service records up on her phone. A transmission fluid top-off had been performed 6 weeks earlier during a routine appointment at the authorized dealership. Isaac absorbed this without visible reaction. Charlotte broke the silence deliberately. 5 specialists reviewed this vehicle. Each of them concluded the transmission is non-functional and requires replacement. Do you agree with that assessment? He looked at her for the first time since the car had arrived. His eyes were dark and level, and they held the specific calm of someone who had stopped needing to prove things a long time ago. Someone for whom the performance of confidence had become unnecessary because the thing itself was sufficient. I haven't opened it yet, he said. I don't agree or disagree with people who haven't opened it either. She was still processing that when Nora walked over and stood beside the rear quarter panel of the DB11, looking up at the long silver hood with the same unhurried seriousness her father carried. This is a pretty car, Nora said, to no one in particular. Dad always says pretty cars shouldn't die young. Charlotte did not know how to respond to a 7-year-old who had just said the most reasonable thing anyone had said to her in 3 weeks. Isaac set his terms without negotiation or preamble. He would take the car. He needed 7 days. Charlotte was not to enter the garage while work was in progress. No technical questions until he was ready to answer them. If she wanted to be present on the property during working hours, she was welcome to sit outside. He gestured toward the wooden chair Nora had vacated. Charlotte looked at the chair. It was the kind of furniture that had been repaired more than once by someone who valued it. She looked back at Isaac. "What's your rate?" she asked. "We'll discuss that after I know what's actually wrong," he said. He picked up a rag from the workbench and turned back to the pickup on the lift. The conversation was over. Charlotte stood in the gravel lot for a moment, with no useful direction available to her. She had not sat outside a garage on a wooden chair waiting on someone else's schedule since she was a teenager spending summer afternoons waiting for her father to finish work so they could drive home together. She had a feeling she was about to do it for an entire week, and she had no framework for that. No template from any of the years she had spent building a world where she was always the one being waited for. On the first day, Isaac removed the access panels and dropped the undercarriage shield without a word in Charlotte's direction. She arrived at 7 in the morning and sat in the wooden chair just outside the bay door with a coffee she had bought from a gas station 2 miles away, because there was nowhere between her hotel and Oak Creek Road that was open at that hour and had any business calling itself a coffee establishment. Nora arrived at 8:15, backpack on, rabbit tucked under one arm, and set a second gas station cup beside Charlotte's chair without saying a word, then walked inside to kiss her father goodbye before school. Charlotte looked at the cup for a moment. Then she picked it up. On the second day, she began to listen. Not to anything she could fully interpret. Isaac worked mostly in silence, and when he did speak, it was in fragments, low and technical, directed at the machine rather than at any person present. But twice in the afternoon she heard him shift into German, not conversational German, but the compressed, precise language of someone working through a calculation out loud, someone for whom the mother tongue of the problem was more efficient than anything else. She called Maya from the parking lot and asked if the firm had anyone on retainer who spoke German well enough to translate technical speech. Maya told her she would find someone. On the third day, Isaac came to the bay door at 2:30 and stood there long enough that Charlotte looked up from the proposal documents she had been reviewing on her phone. He said, "None of them were completely wrong." He paused. None of them were completely right either. He returned to the garage before she could ask what he meant. She sat with the sentence for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over, unable to place it. It was not reassurance. It was not a verdict. It was the kind of statement that contained an answer she did not yet have the surrounding context to understand. On the fourth day, Nora sat in the chair beside her after school and asked, with the directness that belongs exclusively to children and very old people, whether Charlotte had any kids. Charlotte said no. Nora considered this with the mild, unencumbered attention children give to facts that interest them. "My dad says people without kids worry more," she said, "because there's nobody else to think about besides yourself." Charlotte lowered her phone and looked at the girl. Nora was already back to her notebook, drawing what appeared to be a horse wearing a rather elaborate hat. Charlotte did not respond, because she was not sure the observation required one, and also because she suspected it was accurate in a way she had never had occasion to consider before. On the fifth day, Maya sent a 2-paragraph summary of a phone call she had managed to partially document through means she declined to fully explain. Isaac had called a number in Stuttgart at 11 in the evening. The contact had been identified provisionally as a former AMG engineer who had worked in the same transmission development division during the same period as Isaac. The call had lasted 41 minutes. Maya's translated summary of the key exchange. Isaac had been asking the contact to confirm a specific firmware parameter from a vehicle production batch manufactured during a particular 3-month window. The contact had confirmed it. Isaac had said, in German, "That's it." Then the call ended. Charlotte read Maya's summary 3 times and did not send a reply. She sat with it the way she had been sitting with everything that week, aware that something was being assembled in the garage on the other side of the wall, unable to see it, unwilling to stop waiting for it. On the 6th day, she drove to the garage and found a handwritten note taped to the gate, "Don't come today." She sat in her rental car on the side of Oak Creek Road for 1 hour and 40 minutes, watching a pair of mockingbirds negotiate a section of fence with increasing intensity before accepting that she was not going to be able to make herself leave. She stayed for another 40 minutes. Then she drove back to the hotel and sat on the edge of the bed in her suit, shoes still on, and let a call from Graves's assistant go to voicemail at 6:15 in the evening. She called back at 7 and told the assistant the car would be ready. She said it with the certainty she had trained into her voice over 15 years of leadership. She was not certain. She was, for the first time in a very long time, operating on something closer to faith than evidence, and she did not have a name for what that felt like, only the awareness that it was unfamiliar and that she had not retreated from it. On the 7th day, she arrived at 5:45 in the morning and sat in the chair in the dark. The street light at the near end of Oak Creek Road made a pale circle in the gravel. When Isaac came out of the garage at 6, he did not appear surprised to find her already there. He looked at her in the gray early light, considered something briefly, and said, "Come inside." The DB11 was on the lift, its undercarriage fully exposed, the transmission casing open in a way Charlotte had never seen outside of a manufacturer's technical manual. The interior of the gearbox was illuminated by 2 work lights, positioned with the careful logic of a surgical suite, and she could see the clutch assemblies and the valve body and the internal hydraulic channels with a clinical clarity that made the machine look less like a car component and more like something that had been persuaded to give up its secrets. Isaac stood beside the vehicle and spoke without looking at her, the way people speak when they are accustomed to explaining things to colleagues rather than to audiences. The transmission, he told her, was mechanically intact. Every internal component was within specification. The clutch pack showed normal wear consistent with the vehicle's mileage, nothing more. The torque converter was functioning correctly. The hydraulic circuit had no damage, no contamination, no evidence of the thermal stress that the second report had described as the primary cause of failure. Charlotte did not say anything. She was listening with the particular quality of attention that comes when someone is carefully dismantling a structure you have spent 3 weeks building and believing in. What had actually happened, Isaac continued, was a failure of the transmission oil pressure sensor, a component 73 millimeters in length, positioned on the lower valve body housing. The sensor had failed in a specific and uncommon way. Rather than going silent, it had sent a continuous false signal, indicating catastrophic pressure loss throughout the system. The vehicle's engine control unit had received that signal and responded exactly as it had been programmed to respond. It had activated a full protective lockout, freezing the transmission in a fail-safe state to prevent what it believed was imminent catastrophic mechanical failure. The gearbox had not failed. It had been ordered to stop by a module that was telling it something that was not true. The reason no one had identified this, he explained, was not a failure of intelligence or effort, but of specificity. The DB11 produced during a 3-month window of that particular production year 47 vehicles in total had been fitted with an ECU firmware version that processed pressure sensor failures differently from every other vehicle in the model line. In the standard firmware, a sensor fault triggered a dashboard warning and a reduced performance mode. In this version, it triggered a complete system lockout, with no fault code that any standard diagnostic scanner would read as sensor-related. Every tool connected to the car had read the lockout, interpreted it as the thing it most closely resembled, and concluded what the lockout appeared to say: total transmission failure. No one among the 5 specialists had gone looking for a cause behind the effect, because the effect was so absolute, it appeared to be self-explanatory. The knowledge of this firmware variant existed in a single internal document distributed at a closed technical workshop in Frankfurt, attended by a small number of transmission engineers from AMG and Aston Martin's development partners. Isaac had been in that room. He had filed the information carefully in the part of his memory reserved for things unlikely to matter soon, and 11 days ago, while walking 3 times around a car he had not yet touched, he had opened that file. The sensor itself had cost $340. The labor to replace it and recalibrate the ECU using the correct non-standard protocol, a process Isaac had completed across 2 nights, alone, while Charlotte sat in a hotel and tried not to think too directly about the word Thursday, had taken 4 hours. He had driven the car on Oak Creek Road at 2 in the morning, with Nora asleep in the back seat and her rabbit on the center console, because he had needed to be certain before he said anything. "What is the total?" Charlotte asked. Her voice came out quieter than she had intended, as though the room had changed the size of the space available for it. $840, Isaac told her. The sensor, the fluid replacement, and the ECU recalibration. He had documented every step. She did not react the way she might have expected herself to react. There was no relief, not immediately. What came first was a slow, settling reckoning with how close she had come to authorizing $271,000 of work on a component that required none, not because she had been careless or credulous, but because she had asked credentialed people the wrong question and accepted their answers as the available truth. She had asked what was wrong with the transmission. The right question had been what was wrong with the car. Isaac had asked the right question before touching a single part of either one. She turned from the vehicle and looked at the wall of the garage, truly looked at it for the first time in 7 days, and she saw the photograph. Isaac, at perhaps 28, in the navy coveralls of the AMG engineering team, standing in a workshop that looked like something between a laboratory and a cathedral of precision. Beside him, a woman with her head tipped easily toward his shoulder, and a smile that looked like it had always lived in her face and always would, cradled in Isaac's arms. A bundle so new to the world that the world had not yet fully registered it, scrawled in marker at the lower corner. Nora, Day 1. Charlotte looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she turned back to Isaac. He was wiping his hands on a rag with the same unhurried motion she had watched him perform 100 times over the past 7 days, and he was not looking at her because he did not need to see her face to know what she was working out. She sat down in Nora's chair, which Isaac had at some point moved inside the bay, and she asked him something she had not planned to ask. "Why did you leave Stuttgart?" He folded the rag and set it on the bench. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might choose not to answer. Then he said, "My wife passed when Nora was 9 months old. Aneurysm. No warning, nothing before it." He paused. "I could not be in Germany and be a father at the same time. My grandfather had left me this. So I came back." He gestured at the garage with a motion that was neither dismissive nor proud, simply accurate, the gesture of a man indicating something that is simply and completely true. I chose Nora. Charlotte asked if he ever regretted the choice. He thought about that with the seriousness he brought to mechanical problems, not the performance of consideration, but the actual thing. Every day, he said, and not once. Charlotte sat with that answer for a moment. It was the kind of thing that sounds like a contradiction until suddenly it doesn't, until you understand that both halves are simultaneously true and that the only dishonest response would be to choose one over the other. Then, she laid it out plainly, without dressing it up. The position of Chief Technical Officer at Voss Prestige Motors. Complete authority over the service and engineering divisions. A salary she named without hesitation, because hesitating over a number she had already calculated would have been its own kind of insult. Equity participation. A proper facility with a team he would build himself, access to resources and vehicle catalogs and manufacturer relationships that the current situation had no path to, and the kind of platform that would let him work on problems truly worthy of what he knew. Isaac listened to all of it. He let the offer sit in the air between them for long enough that Charlotte could feel the weight of it. Then he shook his head. Once. Without theater or apology. Nora's school is 3 blocks from here, he said. I bring her lunch on Tuesdays. Her teacher lets me eat with the class because Nora asked and the teacher said yes. He looked at Charlotte directly. There is no salary that replaces that. Charlotte found she could not argue with this, which was unusual for her. She had arguments for most things. She asked instead, "Then what can I do for you?" And she meant it as the genuine question it was. Not a negotiating position, not a social courtesy, but the honest inquiry of someone who had just watched a man outperform every resource available to her, and who wanted to understand what the correct reciprocation looked like. Isaac thought about it in the same unhurried way he thought about everything. If you have a client with a car nobody can figure out, he said, you know where I am. That's enough. Charlotte nodded. She placed her business card on the bench beside the folded rag. If you ever change your mind, she said, and left the sentence unfinished, because finishing it would have implied she expected him to, and she had already understood that she did not. Nora arrived home from school, while Charlotte was still in the garage. The girl dropped her backpack in its habitual spot by the door, with the authority of someone who had done it in exactly that location for years, walked directly to the DB11, and placed both palms flat on the hood. She stood there for a moment with her head slightly tilted, as though listening for something only she knew to listen for. Then she turned to her father. "Dad, is it better?" Isaac said. "It's better." Nora nodded once, with the placid certainty of someone confirming a fact that was always going to be true, retrieved her backpack, and went to find her rabbit. Charlotte drove away from Oak Creek Road an hour later. She found, as she turned onto the main road and the gate disappeared from her mirrors, that the week had a quality she had not anticipated and could not entirely name, not simply the resolution of the problem, but something in the particular texture of how it had been resolved. She had sat in a wooden chair outside a garage for 7 days and had been given almost nothing in the way of reassurance or information, and she had stayed. She had stayed because something in the economy of Isaac Hayes, the total absence of performance, the complete refusal to manage her expectations or ornament, his confidence had communicated, without ever stating it, that the work was being done correctly. She had not known before this week that she was capable of trusting something that quiet. Elliot Graves arrived on Friday afternoon, as scheduled, with the punctual and unannounced quality he brought to everything. He drove the DB11 for 22 minutes. Along the route, Charlotte had mapped the same waterfront road where the transmission had seized 3 weeks earlier, plus a return loop including a stretch of uphill gradient that would tax the gearbox precisely where the original failure had occurred. The car shifted through every gear without hesitation. The engine pulled clean and full through the top of its range. The cabin was as quiet as the day the car had left the factory. Graves parked in front of the Voss building, sat for a moment after the engine went quiet, then stepped out and handed Charlotte the key. "Who worked on it?" he asked. "An engineer I trust," she said. "From your network?" "No." Graves turned the key over in his hand once, the slow, deliberate motion of someone who was thinking about something other than the key. He was a man who had spent 60 years reading other people, and he was reading Charlotte now. He found something in her face he had not seen before. Not the controlled confidence she wore like a second architecture, but something underneath it that had been rearranged, something that had the look of a thing recently and genuinely learned. He was experienced enough to recognize that certain problems, when they resolve in a particular way, do not simply end, they alter the person they happen to. He had seen that in business and in the parts of life that did not carry business names. He did not ask what had changed. He asked, "The cost?" Charlotte looked at him steadily. $840. Graves was quiet for a long moment. He did not express surprise. He had lived long enough to know that the most expensive answer and the correct answer rarely shared a building. The best ones, he said, almost to himself, are never where you expect to look. He extended his hand. They shook. He told her he would be in touch the following week about the partnership renewal, and his tone carried the quiet warmth of something that had already been decided before he got into the car. That evening, Charlotte drove west on her own time, in the rental car she had been using for 3 weeks and had largely stopped registering as unfamiliar. She turned onto Oak Creek Road as the light went amber, the particular quality of evening light that makes even tired streets look briefly significant. The gate of Hayes' garage was closed and locked for the night, and from the road she could see through the side window of the small attached house a square of warm yellow light, and within it 2 silhouettes, one large, one small, seated together at what appeared to be a dinner table. The small one was doing most of the talking. The large one was listening with complete, undivided attention, the way a person listens when there is nowhere else they would rather be, and nothing they consider more important than the voice in front of them. Charlotte did not stop the car. She drove back the way she had come and did not turn on the radio. She thought, without sentimentality, but with the particular precision that was her best mode of thought, about what the week had actually demonstrated. Not about Isaac Hayes specifically, though she would think about him often in the months that followed, the way you think about things that correct something fundamental in you, but about the habit, deeply worn into years of practiced certainty, of arriving at conclusions before the evidence was complete, of trusting institutions because they were large and credentialed and expensive, and treating those qualities as a reliable proxy for being right, of confusing the confidence of experts with the accuracy of their expertise, 2 things that she had always known were not the same and had somehow, without noticing, begun to treat as though they were. She had nearly spent $271,000 replacing a component that a $340 sensor had been falsely accusing. She had been corrected by a man who earned his living in a 2-bay garage on a road most of her colleagues had never thought to find, who had walked into a room in Frankfurt years ago and kept something quietly in memory until the morning it became the only thing that mattered, and who had turned down everything she could offer him because Tuesday lunches with his daughter were not an item on any salary schedule she had the authority to match. She added his number to her phone under a new contact entry, Isaac Hayes, Hayes Garage, Oak Creek Road. Below the number, she typed 4 words and saved it without revision. Do not call late. Then she drove back to the hotel, ordered dinner for the first time in 3 weeks without simultaneously reviewing documents, and ate it in the kind of quiet she had not known she had been missing.